EU has a problem.
In just 50 years, its GDP has grown by more than 10 times. Villages were replaced by megacities. More than 800 million people lifted themselves out of poverty.
After many decades of economic homogeny, Europe is slowly but surely lagging behind new emerging power. And the issue, well, the EU doesn't have a solution for this. Europe and China are playing two completely different economic games, and the rulebook for the Chinese game was written by the Chinese. China's economic system is state-led and centralized, and so if Beijing says, we want to focus on semiconductors, electric cars, or wind energy, suddenly the whole system falls into line. The regional administrations fall into line, the state banks provide loans, and before you know it, there are huge industrial zones springing up overnight. There's no debate going on in 27 legislatures, no compromises reached between competing national agendas. But let's compare and contrast all of this with the European Union. The European Union is an economic wonder in so many ways, a market of 450 million people with free flow of goods, services, and capital. But it's also a very complicated bargaining machine. Every big economic policy needs to be agreed on by 27 member states, each with its own politics, economic agendas, and baggage. France looks after its farmers, Germany looks after its car industry, countries in Eastern Europe look to catch up economically, and then there's the Netherlands, which looks after free trade. Italy is worried about its debt. This kind of fragmentation causes institutional paralysis. By the time the EU has reached an agreement over an industrial strategy and regulatory framework, China has already established its grip over the market. While the EU was deciding over the terms of state aid regulations concerning subsidies, China was investing massive amounts of money in its semiconductor sector. While the EU was deciding over its Green Deal schedule, China had established its leadership in the global market in terms of producing solar panels and wind turbines. China's advantage here is threefold: speed, scale, and coordination. Speed because autocratic systems can pivot without democratic deliberation. Scale because China can mobilize resources across its entire economy simultaneously. Coordination because there's no tension between national and supranational interests. They're one and the same. This is where theory meets reality. And the reality is grim.
Manufacturing in the Eurozone contracted again in July for the 11th straight month.
Eurozone manufacturing activity showed little sign of recovery last month.
Europe is undergoing a process of slow-motion deindustrialization, while the world's factory has become China. China is currently representing about 30% of the global production output, surpassing the United States, Japan, and Germany. It leads the supply chains in almost all the key sectors, including electronics, machinery, chemicals, steel, and textiles, and now even in advanced sectors like semiconductors and electric cars. With the outbreak of the pandemic and the disruption in supply chains, the world realized how much it relied on the Chinese production base. But how did we end up here?
Europe's largest car maker, Volkswagen, has opened a new factory in the Chinese province of Guangdong.
Europe placed a deliberate wager in the 1990s and 2000s. It would shift production to lower-cost countries but maintain higher-value services in Europe. This approach made perfect sense. Why produce when you can innovate? Europe shifted production to China to leverage cheap labor, and consumers in Europe benefited from lower prices. However, Europe made a significant mistake in exchange for that bargain. It sacrificed its innovation-enabling industrial base. Manufacturing and innovation cannot be so easily distinguished as economists have traditionally suggested. When you lose manufacturing, eventually you'll lose the engineering expertise, the supply chains, and the improvements associated with having designers and manufacturers in the same community. This is what Germany's Mittelstand firms knew so well: the mid-sized manufacturers that kept manufacturing at home. But even they're in trouble. The cost gap is brutal. The cost of labor in European manufacturing is among the highest in the world. The cost of energy, particularly post-Ukraine crisis, is through the roof. The cost of industrial electricity in Germany is 3 to 4 times the cost of the United States or China. And then you factor the tough environmental and labor regulations and permitting requirements of the European Union. On the other hand, China has ensured that the cost of energy remains under control, has lower labor costs despite the rise in salaries, and has simplified regulations if it is economically justified. The outcome? European firms are increasingly setting up their manufacturing facilities in China, not to serve the Chinese market, but because it's where it makes sense to manufacture.
Europe is a big user of digital technology, but it relies heavily on the US and China for its digital infrastructure.
Now, Europe is watching as industrial policy in China and the US threatens to leave the continent behind. That's the backdrop for EU leaders meeting in Brussels, who face tough decisions on keeping the region competitive.
While manufacturing was the weakness of Europe's past, technology is the crisis of the present. Take a stroll through any big city in China today, and you'll notice something remarkable. The cars are electric, the buses are electric, and even the delivery scooters are electric. China didn't merely ride the wave of the electric vehicle revolution, it led the charge. Chinese companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng aren't merely competitive, they're leading the pack. BYD recently passed Tesla in global sales of electric vehicles. The batteries that power these vehicles? Controlled by China's CATL, which alone accounts for a third of the global market. It's more than just cars. China is a leader in solar panel manufacturing, accounting for around 80% of global value chains from polysilicon to solar panels, and wind turbine manufacturing is dominated by Chinese companies too. In AI, although basic AI research is led by the US, Chinese companies are leaders in applications of AI such as facial recognition, smart cities, fintech, and logistics. Data availability is a significant challenge for European companies competing with Chinese players in AI technology. But where has innovation in Europe gone? Europe continues to produce excellent innovation, since Europe's universities and institutes are still publishing excellent science. The issue lies in the valley of death between innovation and implementation. A great innovation in Munich or Paris will often be implemented in Silicon Valley or Shenzhen, not in Europe. The answer is structural. Europe's capital markets are still fragmented, so it's more difficult for startups to access the capital they need to compete on the global stage. Europe's pension funds and institutional investors are more risk-averse and invest in established businesses, not startups in the tech space. Europe is fragmented in its rules and regulations, so startups face 27 markets with 27 sets of rules. Europe is inflexible in its labor markets. At the same time, the Chinese model brings together state capital, long-term investment, vast home markets for prototyping and iteration, and increasingly advanced human talent. Once a technology has been deemed strategic by Chinese decision makers, the support infrastructure from university labs to venture capital and government purchasing is mobilized. Energy is a basis of industrial competitiveness, and in this respect, Europe has a very disadvantageous position. Following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the energy system in Europe came apart. Europe was dependent on the cheap and reliable natural gas imports from Russia, gas that was piped in a way that was seemingly geopolitically secure until it wasn't. With the turn-off of the spigot, European energy prices went through the roof. Industrial electricity prices that were already relatively higher than the rest of the world doubled or tripled. Energy-intensive sectors such as chemicals, steel, aluminum, and glass industries were forced to confront an existential crisis. Should they shut down, move elsewhere, or continue to lose money? In contrast, China has controlled energy prices with public power companies and various supply channels. They consume coal, still 60% for electricity, but also lead in terms of installations for renewable energy resources. They have secured long-term gas contracts with Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The energy strategy is subordinated to industry policy, not vice versa. Such a difference in energy costs is of vital importance. When a German chemical company has to pay 3 times as much for electricity as a Chinese one, there's no point in looking for ways to boost productivity, as the gap will never be bridged. Companies are no longer thinking about relocating, they're actually relocating. The biggest European chemical firm, BASF, is investing in China and the US. Then there is the imbalance of trade. The trade deficit of Europe with China has escalated. It's now over 290 billion euros. It exports much less to China compared to the amount of imports. What does it export to China? Luxury products, some machinery, some chemicals, aircraft. But the imbalance continues in the matter of market access. It's very difficult for European companies to enter the Chinese market. There are joint ventures, technology pressure, administrative hurdles, and changes of heart. But the Chinese companies have easy access to the European market. They're shielded by European competition law. European policymakers are slowly awakening to this imbalance. But what does this mean for Europe? It's a troubling trend, but not one that's irreversible at this point. The first and most pressing one is economic dependence. To be dependent on China for such things as batteries, semiconductors, and rare earth elements is to lack strategic independence. This was made starkly apparent by the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis, where economic dependencies turn into strategic vulnerabilities in very short order. Europe's economic power is waning compared to China and the US, and this is causing it to lose influence geopolitically. Europe is facing a situation where it will be a spectator in the great power struggle of the 21st century. But there is a way ahead. The European Chips Act and Green Deal Industrial Plan demonstrate the recognition that Europe needs real industrial policy. The question is whether Europe can act fast enough. Can it hold its unity among 27 members? Can it attract the capital on the scale required to compete effectively? The China problem is escalating with China's movement up the value chain. The next years will tell whether Europe manages to adapt successfully or whether it further declines from being an industrial power to being an economic periphery.